At this very time, we're heading straight into our business tips and quotes as you start your day with lots of inspirations. But of course, before we get there, don't forget the markets on the Zabo platform. Just a few minutes from now, about 12 minutes left for the markets to open. And of course, they open every 8:15 a.m. every day, 8:15 a.m. up to 3:15 p.m. effective Monday up to Friday, except on the weekends and the public holidays when these markets are not in. You can't access them, in other words. But anyway, what do you need to do to be a part of this? Simply dial *292#. You'll be availed with lots of options. You can buy government bonds and securities for just as little as 15,000 Ugandan shillings, but you can choose to invest more. But Zabo simply says start with 15,000 to make life much more easy and friendly. Now, there is no excuse why you shouldn't own the government bonds and securities. Zabo just made this a reality for any person. In case you have a smartphone, *292#. Zabo says, my money, my future. And all Texas East Africa says, do something new. And now let's dive into our business tips and quotes. Well, that is it for the business tips and quotes. Very essential to start your day when really very, very inspired. Well, now heading straight into our SMB trends this morning. Of course, there has been reports regarding the International Monetary Fund setting itself to cut loans, which it gives to different countries to fund their budgets. And this cut is going to be, it's estimated at 36% cut. And, we need to understand what does it really mean to the countries which have been largely, that is, surviving on the funding from the International Monetary Fund. Of course, following the ongoing inflationary pressures, governments don't seem to be operating as they used to operate way back in the time. In other words, the governments, in quotes, are broke. Yeah, in terms of that. And lately, it's like, there are quite some sorts of assessment policies that are carried out by the International Monetary Fund. The risk assessment when you're actually getting this loan. What is your capability to clear it back, not to default on this loan? And now, considering all these factors and the current global inflation, moving on, definitely there is anticipations of a reduction of 36% cut of loans that are issued by the International Monetary Fund. But anyway, before we get into any further discussions, let's first have a look at what do the members of parliament have to say about this. What does this really mean for the country Uganda? But when I return, I'm joined with Joram Paul Sonko, who shall be dissecting this matter much more further.
The International Monetary Fund, commonly known in short as IMF, receives money from its member countries. This money it uses to give grants to less developed and developing countries. They are given grants, while other countries, including the developing countries, can also access loans from the IMF. Now, The IMF has declared that it will reduce funding by a substantial percentage, above 30% from next year. And this has been communicated to us by our Minister of Finance. This means that what we have been receiving to support our budget is also going to reduce. It means that as a country, we must survive on our own resources. Survival on our resources is that our people must learn that now they must pay taxes. And taxes are initiated. This is why we have had several tax bills in which some new taxes have been paid. It is therefore my appeal to Ugandans to brace themselves up for a tough economy, tough in the sense that they are going to be the ones to finance the economy by paying more taxes. But secondly, because IMF has reduced its funding, it is going to be tough times ahead.
However, I believe this is a call on for developing countries to strategize its own economy, to build a bold economy so that it cannot entirely rely on foreign aid, because they bear the right even to withdraw to 0%. However, I do believe that most of the fund that is being got from IMF is accountable for interest. Most of these countries do return that money with the interest captured on it. Therefore, if they are tired of our interest, maybe if they are tired of lending developing countries, it's upon their rights. But the only sense that Ugandans and the other poor developing countries have to do is to build their own stable, bold economy so that they reduce on the dependency syndrome. Because some countries like Uganda, we have all the resources that we can put into use to accumulate our foreign exchange earning by exportation. We have all the natural resources, including water resource, minerals, even atmosphere. Our atmosphere is a good resource to the development of this country. But what lacks is to apply real planning for our economy and also fight against corruption and any other incidences of corruption, swindling, embezzlement of Uganda money, and the accountability on the tax collection and having the real definition of the equal benefit from the taxpayer and the tax collector. That's what will reduce against the dependence syndrome and the scare by the International Monetary Fund over the withdrawal of their financial aid.
Yes, that's what I'm appealing. I'm appealing to Ugandans to get ready to pay more taxes. And therefore, the tax body itself must go about its business to approach the citizens with empathy and mentor them and teach them that taxes is their own survival. We cannot cry for good roads, we cannot cry for markets, we cannot cry for good telephone communication, we cannot cry for good hospitals, serviced hospitals, if we are not paying money. So once these grants are stopped, it means if we want medicine in the hospitals, we want good roads, it must be through the money that we have raised internally from our own taxes. And therefore the people must be mentored to make sure that they learn that henceforth they are the ones to finance the economy.
Well, what could this impact? How could this impact that is the developing countries? And this concerns you as an individual citizen, as a Ugandan. You need to really take notice of what is really happening here. Now, taking a look before we get into the major general statistics, looking at the countries that have been surviving, that is on, not necessarily surviving, but have been getting support from the International Monetary Fund to fund their budgets. According to the IMF Sub-Saharan Regional Economic Outlook, that is the big funding squeeze which is happening around this region. We see that growth in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to slow. That is to 3.6% as big funding squeeze, of course, tied to drying up of aid and access to private finance. Now, I'm joined with Joram as we share more hints regarding this very matter. Very good morning, Joram. Welcome to S&P. How are you today?
Good morning, good morning.
Yeah.
It's a good day.
Yeah,
it's
good.
a good one as well,
Very.
I should say. And a good day to be alive.
Perfect.
And, well, of course, the weather is continuing to be a little bit more cold lately.
Yeah, it's unpredictable.
Yeah.
You know.
But then we're moving on well.
Of course, that's the most important aspect. Now, before we get into some other countries which have really been surviving, that's developed and developing countries. There is IMF Sub-Regional Africa Region Economic Outlook, a report, this is of April 2023, which talks about that growth in Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to slow to 3.6% as, attributed to a funding squeeze. In other words, the funding is not really coming out well, and following the 36% cut, and the financial systems in these Sub-Saharan countries are not really efficient. Inflation is at the maximum. The governments seem to have failed to actually try to curb the inflation, and I think that is something we shouldn't take lightly.
Well, I think when you look at the fact that they would say there will be growth, but it will be squeezed.
Yes.
By the fact that there will be less funding, it is because at times you realize our economies, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think we are having a very huge challenge when it comes to funding or trying to sustain our own economies. So sustaining the economy on our own self has become a very huge issue. That is why we normally go in for loans or continue to come through and ask for donations and whatever the case from international funders. Because you get to realize that in Africa, it is very rare for an African country to drive their own economies.
Entirely,
whereby an economy is entirely driven by Africa, and it's not anyone like
a foreign hand.
In a foreign hand. Because at the end of the day, even when the budget comes through, you get to realize that the money is not enough for the budget. There are supplementary budgets that come through. So in the long run, when the supplementary budgets come in, that is where you find that most of these countries tend to bail out or tend to start looking for financial, extended facilities and everything. So I think, how do we then, as a country, create room for a sustainable economy? How do we establish an economy which is ideally self-driven?
Very true.
Whereby the money comes in from our country, from our economy, or the key drivers of the economy, and the loans come in where need be, especially the external loans, because we already have these particular domestic loans that the government does take. Now, besides that, if you go externally, the interest rates increase at the end of it all. So I think we need to create first a more advanced economy that is going to give a wide economy, I should say, that is going to give us that independent mentality, whereby unless we have supplementary budgets coming in, that is when we start stretching out for external, loan facilities and trying to at least stay, stay active in this kind of era that we are in. And of course, you get to realize that the economy can still move on if we continue to at least establish the core values of putting everything together. I think that would be a better way for us.
Yeah, and personally, I was even thinking throughout this aspect. I think it's high time we started to focus on production and value addition, exporting more. Because when I try to examine taxes I try to look at a scenario whereby it's a 50-50, the government benefiting and also the citizens not being squeezed so hard. Governments this is the time, because all we lack in Africa, because we have whatever it takes, but government empowerment, empowerment of governments for us to produce, to add value to what we produce, because we have the resources. We have what it takes that can compete on the world market if we give it ultimate attention. And if we export more, because we import more, you know, because taxes might be unrealistic. Because I've been here in the Members of Parliament talking about Ugandans we should prepare to pay more taxes than ever before. I would think, other than averting the pressure onto the citizens whose earnings are also not efficient, why don't you create a favorable atmosphere, you know, for them to trade and make money? And you know, they invest in factories, they invest in so many, you know, there are quite so many sectors that can be invested in Africa. You know, I don't want to limit this to Uganda, you know, because now when I look at the AfCFTA, the African Free Trade, I look at Africa now as one market. Very true. So this union between empowerment, and you know, it would be important if we started this. I feel like we should start it from regional levels. ECOWAS, establish yourselves. East Africa, SADC, you know, and the northern, you know, those countries in the north. And we have, because once we perfect cooperation among us regional, I mean, we're unstoppable, but still just a few loopholes. Because now I feel like this is not just a journey for Uganda alone. You know, I think it's the time for Africa to realize that now we need to be boundaries can't define us anymore. You know, we need to be defined as a country. This is the only way we can generate revenue to add value, you know, and we export to these countries, and we have bargaining power in that way when we're united. I'm just thinking about this. Well, that is how it plays out. Yeah. Well, now let's take a look at a list of the countries that have used IMF funding to actually finance their budgets. Of course, looking at developing countries and second class, what we can call second class. Now at least there is Argentina, yes, with a 57 billion loan. The 57 billion loan was disbursed in installments over 3 years. That is between 2018 to 2021. Now, Argentina had been experiencing a currency crisis, high inflation, and a large budget deficit before receiving the loan. And now the loan came with conditions attached, including tight fiscal measures and structural reforms, which were aimed at boosting economic growth and reducing inflation.
And well, of course, as you look at the other countries on the list, includes Egypt. Now, Egypt in 2016 got a loan from the IMF worth $12 billion, which was disbursed over 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. And Egypt was facing a balance of payment crisis due to a decline in tourism and foreign investment, as well as high debt levels. The loan at the time came with conditions that were attached, including fiscal consolidation measures. Then there were reforms to improve the business climate and attract investment, and social safety net programs to protect the vulnerable at the time.
Yes, now we still see number 3, Greece. Yes, now the $295 billion in loans were disbursed in multiple tranches over the course of 8 years. That is from 2010 to 2018. Now, Greece was facing a sovereign debt crisis that threatened its membership in the Eurozone. I think you remember that time when Greece, that pressure was too much about when there was high inflation, people went to the banks to withdraw money and the banks didn't have money. You know, that was very tricky. Now, the loans came with strict conditions attached, including significant austerity measures and structural reforms aimed at improving competitiveness, reducing corruption, and strengthening institutions.
And then as we move on to the next one, you look at Ukraine. Ukraine, which is also currently facing an economic situation in there, or an economic crisis. Between 2015 to 2019, the Ukraine received a loan of 17.5 billion, which was disbursed over 4 years. Now, Ukraine was facing a severe economic crisis, including a sharp decline in GDP and a large budget deficit, as well as a conflict with Russia in the east of the country. Now, currently, is still a very huge one as well. And now, Ukraine had a loan coming in with conditions attached, including fiscal austerity measures, structural reforms aimed at improving the business climate and reducing corruption, to further strengthen their banking system, something that they had to comply with in order to receive this loan from the International Monetary Fund.
Well, now away from Ukraine, we cross over to Pakistan. Yes, now the 6 billion loan was disbursed over 3 years. That is from 2019 to 2022. Now, Pakistan was facing a balance of payments crisis due to a large credit deficit and declining foreign reserves. Now, the loan came along with conditions attached with, of course, fiscal consolidation measures, reforms to improve the business climate and attract investment, and social safety net programs to protect that is the vulnerable.
And well, when you look at Jamaica here, 1.64 billion of a loan was disbursed over 4 years. That was from 2013 to 2017. Jamaica was facing a severe fiscal crisis with a large budget deficit and high debt levels. Now, the loan came with conditions that were attached, including fiscal austerity measures as well, structural reforms aimed at improving the business climate and also reducing corruption, and the social safety net programs to protect the vulnerable group. So that is according to what was highlighted while Jamaica was applying for this loan from the IMF.
Well, now coming in here is Tunisia, as the 2.9 billion loan was disbursed for over 4 years from 2013, and that is to 2017. Now, Tunisia was facing a balance of payment crisis and due to declining tourism revenues and high debt levels. Now, the loan came with conditions attached, including fiscal austerity measures, structural reforms aimed at improving the business climate and reducing corruption. Yes, corruption and social safety net programs to protect the vulnerable at the same time.
And away from Tunisia, we now tend to look at Ukraine.
Once again.
Now, Ukraine here, when you look at the fact that even currently they are into a crisis due to that particular conflict between them and Russia, which kicked off last year. But besides that, this was a second loan from the IMF, where the 3.9 billion loan was disbursed in 2 tranches in 2020 to support Ukraine's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its ongoing reform efforts. Now, the loan came with conditions attached, like the others. This time around, physical consolidation measures, structural reforms that were aimed at improving the business climate and reducing corruption, and measures to strengthen the healthcare system and social safety net programs.
Finally, Belarus, the $2.1 billion loan was disbursed in 2 tranches. That is in 2020. That is to support Belarus economic reform program and address its balance of payment difficulties. Now, of course, the loan came with conditions attached, like the rest, including fiscal consolidation measures, structural reforms aimed at improving business climate and reducing corruption, and measures to strengthen the banking system and social safety for net programs. You know what I've come to realize about this whole, IMF has conditions in which if you to get a loan, you have to fulfill. And you realize all these there is a similarity amongst all the conditions that come to that. But unfortunately, in some countries now, like Uganda's case, we are in red. We are in reds already. I mean, there is a high debt risk. I mean, if you're saying that you're lending Uganda money, you're risking highly. I think
you're only risking because you don't know when we're going to pay back. I think the only problem is the time of repaying.
Because even debts need to have deadlines.
Yes, because they do. And of course, the structural reforms, how are we following these structural reforms?
Structural reforms.
So it leaves us with a lot of questions.
Lots of them.
Is that at times, when you look at the fact that we want to apply for these loans, but are we able to pay them back? And
in the required time?
Yes, can we sustain or can we take good use of the loans? Because at least the other reason behind why most of the African countries are not just given loans out of the blue, or even when they ask, it's difficult lately because of the fact that every country is now rushing to the IMF or the World Bank. So it is because they want to look at the structural reforms that you're setting up. How do you intend to use this money? Is it going to be productive? And let's say if they've given you a loan disbursement of 3 years or 5, how then are you going to pay? Are you sure enough that in the next 15 or 20 years that money will be going back to the IMF? What reforms have you put in place to ensure that this happens? So these are the things that they steadily look at, and how we position ourselves as Ugandans. I doubt whether at times we attract this kind of loans from the IMF.
All right. As you're watching Smart Makes Business, what's your say about this? Of course, you can hit us on our Twitter handle, Smart24 TV, and tell us, what do you think? Are we in position to actually, are we ready? You know, what could be limiting us to attract these loans from the International Monetary Fund? And now with the current cut of loans by 36%, what do you think? What is the way forward? Now, particularly for Uganda, you know, looking at leaving out the rest of the countries. Now, this is our own. We are on this on our own as the country Uganda. What should we do since the loans are going to be cut? Could taxes be a viable option, or should we increase productivity and export more as a way to generate more revenue? Well, 28 minutes past 8, still driving business on your daily Kickstarter. And now let's get into a short commercial break. And when we return, of course, business and entertainment and sports, but of course, our developing story. Good morning.